sleep, a time of rest and renewal. But for some, sleep becomes a descent into terror. Tonight, I'll share a story that will make you think twice about closing your eyes. This is the haunting tale of Megan, a viewer whose sleep turned into a nightmare she'll never forget. Megan was an ordinary 25-year-old woman living in a quiet suburban town. She worked long hours at her job, so by the time her head hit the pillow each night, she was usually out cold. Sleep was her refuge, until one fateful night when everything changed. It started on an evening like any other. Megan had just finished her favorite TV show and climbed into bed. The soft glow of her bedside lamp illuminated her room, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. She scrolled through her phone for a bit, then placed it on her nightstand and drifted off to sleep. Hours later, Megan woke up. At first, she thought it was just a bad dream. Her heart was racing and her chest felt tight. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't move. Her arms, legs, even her head, all completely frozen. Panic set in as she realized she was awake but paralyzed. Megan's eyes scanned the room, desperate for something, anything, to explain what was happening. That's when she saw it. At first, it was just a shadow near the corner of her room, but as her eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that didn't seem quite human. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if it was studying her. Megan wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The figure began to move, slowly at first, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim light. Megan's breath hitched as she saw it more clearly now. Its face, or lack of one, was the most horrifying part. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, featureless surface. The creature stood at the foot of her bed, and Megan could feel its gaze, or at least the sensation of being watched, burning into her. A low hum began to fill the room, vibrating through her chest. It wasn't a sound she could hear with her ears. It was something deeper, something she could feel in her bones. Minutes felt like hours as the figure remained there, unmoving. Megan's mind raced. Was she dreaming? Hallucinating? Her logical side tried to make sense of it, but the fear was overwhelming. Then, it moved again. The figure leaned forward, its limbs extending unnaturally as it climbed onto the bed. Megan could feel the mattress sink under its weight. It crawled closer, inch by inch, until it was hovering over her. The humming grew louder, almost deafening now. Megan could feel the pressure on her chest intensify, as if the creature was stealing the air from her lungs. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she was going to pass out. But then the creature did something unexpected. It leaned down, its blank face just inches from hers, and whispered. Megan couldn't understand the words. They were garbled, like a recording played backward. But the tone was chilling. It felt like a warning, though she couldn't be sure. Just as Megan thought she couldn't take any more, the figure suddenly vanished. It didn't fade or walk away. It was simply gone, as if it had never been there. Megan gasped, her body finally able to move again. She shot up in bed, clutching her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her room was silent now, the only sound her own ragged breathing. She turned on every light in her house that night, unable to shake the feeling that the figure might return. Was it just a vivid nightmare? Sleep paralysis? Or had she encountered something far more sinister? For weeks, Megan refused to sleep without the lights on. She avoided her bedroom entirely, opting to sleep on the couch instead. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. Months passed, and Megan began to convince herself it had all been in her head. The human mind plays tricks on itself, she reasoned. Maybe stress, exhaustion, and an overactive imagination had caused the horrifying experience. But then it happened again. This time, Megan wasn't asleep. She was lying on her couch, scrolling through her phone late at night when she felt it. A sudden, overwhelming heaviness. The air in the room changed, growing thick and stifling. Her body froze, just like before, and her phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. She tried to fight it, to move, to scream, but nothing worked. And then she saw it again. The figure was back, standing in the doorway. This time it wasn't alone. Two more figures stood behind it, their forms just as grotesque and unnatural. They moved in unison, stepping closer, their elongated limbs reaching out toward her. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as they surrounded her, their faceless heads tilting as if they were curious. The humming returned, louder and more intense than before. Megan felt her vision dimming, her consciousness slipping away. But just before everything went black, she heard a single clear word amid the chaos, a whisper that sent chills down her spine. Soon Megan woke up hours later alone on her couch. The room was quiet, but the fear remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figures weren't just a product of her mind. She began researching sleep paralysis and was horrified to discover how many people described similar experiences. Shadowy figures, humming sounds, feelings of suffocation. It couldn't all be a coincidence, could it? To this day, Megan sleeps with the lights on, always watching, always waiting. She hasn't seen the figures again, but the memory of their presence is enough to keep her on edge. And that single whispered word, soon, still haunts her. What did they mean, and when would they return? Megan's story is just one of many. Sleep paralysis affects millions of people, but the question remains: are these experiences just tricks of the brain, or are they something far more sinister? Thank you for listening to this chilling tale. If you've experienced something similar, share your story in the comments below. You might just be featured in our next video. Until then, sleep tight if you dare. Alex was a 32-year-old writer, known for his vivid imagination. He lived alone in a small apartment in the city, where the sounds of sirens and distant chatter filled the night air. Writing late into the night was his routine, and on most evenings he fell asleep at his desk. But one particular night, Alex decided to call it early. The apartment was quiet. He turned off his computer, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him, he felt an unusual unease settle over him. He brushed it off as stress from a looming deadline and soon drifted into a restless sleep. Hours later, Alex woke up suddenly, his body stiff as a board. At first, he thought he'd simply slept in an awkward position, but then he realized he couldn't move. His arms, legs, even his head were completely immobilized. His breathing quickened as panic began to set in. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't work. The room was dimly lit by the streetlights outside, casting long shadows across the walls. Alex's eyes darted around the room, desperate to understand what was happening. That's when he noticed it, the figure standing in the corner. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something darker, something that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, with arms that hung unnaturally low. Its head was cocked to the side, as though it were studying him. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as the figure began to move. Its steps were slow and deliberate, and with each movement the room seemed to grow colder. He could hear a faint, raspy sound like shallow breathing, though it wasn't coming from him. As the figure drew closer, Alex realized something even more horrifying. It wasn't alone. Out of the shadows emerged two more figures, identical to the first. They moved in unison, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle. The room filled with an oppressive silence, so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out entirely. Alex tried with all his might to move, to scream, to do anything that would break the paralysis, but his body remained frozen. The figures now stood at the foot of his bed, their faceless heads tilting in sync. He could feel their presence pressing down on him, like an invisible weight suffocating him. The three figures didn't speak, didn't make a sound. They simply stared, or at least, that's what it felt like. Alex's mind raced. Was this a dream? A hallucination? But everything felt so real. The chill in the air, the pressure on his chest, the faint sound of the city outside his window. Suddenly, one of the figures moved. Its arm extended toward him, long and bony, the fingers unnaturally thin and sharp. It hovered just above his chest, and Alex could feel the air grow colder around it. Then, without warning, the figure pressed its hand down on him. The pain was excruciating. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, like the figure was reaching into his very soul. Alex's vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might lose consciousness. The other two figures leaned closer, their heads almost touching his. He could feel their cold breath against his skin, and though they didn't speak, Alex swore he could hear whispers, faint, incomprehensible, but maddeningly persistent. Just when Alex thought he couldn't take it any longer, the figures stepped back. The pressure lifted, and he could breathe again, though his body remained paralyzed. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching and twisting as though alive. Alex's eyes widened in terror as the walls of his bedroom seemed to dissolve, revealing a void, an endless, swirling darkness that felt alive. The three figures stepped into the void, their forms blending with the darkness, and for a moment Alex thought they were leaving. But then they turned back to him. Their faceless heads tilted upward, and a single word echoed through the void, clear and bone-chilling. Join. The room snapped back to normal in an instant. The walls reappeared, the shadows retreated, and Alex could move again. He sat up, gasping for air, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The figures were gone, but the memory of their presence lingered like a stain on his mind. The morning light brought no comfort. Alex paced his apartment, replaying the events of the night in his mind. He tried to rationalize it, sleep paralysis, a vivid nightmare. But deep down, he knew it was something more. The void, the figures, their silent whispers. It all felt too real to dismiss. Over the next few nights, Alex avoided sleep as much as possible, fearing the return of the silent ones. But exhaustion eventually caught up with him. When he finally closed his eyes, the nightmares began again. Not the same as before, but eerily similar. He would wake up in different parts of his apartment, unable to move, with the sensation of being watched. The figures never appeared again, but the whispers persisted. They grew louder each night, and though he couldn't understand the words, he felt their meaning deep within his soul. A warning. A threat. A promise. He wasn't sure. One night, Alex decided he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his laptop and began researching sleep paralysis, desperate for answers. What he found only deepened his fear. Stories of shadow figures, faceless entities, and whispers in the dark were far too common. But one account stood out to him, a story about the silent ones. According to the account, those who encountered them were marked, chosen for something beyond human comprehension. Some claimed the silent ones were watchers from another dimension, while others believed they were harbingers of death. But one detail chilled Alex to the core. The figures always returned. As he read those words, Alex felt the air in his apartment grow colder. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and his computer screen flickered. Slowly, he turned around, and there they were, standing in the doorway, waiting. Alex's story ends here, but his nightmare may have only just begun. Sleep paralysis is a phenomenon that science struggles to explain, leaving the door open to possibilities far darker than we'd like to imagine. Thank you for listening to this harrowing tale. If you've experienced something similar, share your story in the comments below. You may not be alone. Until next time, sleep tight, if you dare.